This interview is with Eva Hoffman in London on the 26th of May 2022. Thank you very much indeed for kindly agreeing to be interviewed for the Association of Jewish Refugees Refugee Voices project today. May we start please by knowing what your name is and where and when you were born?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be part of this project. Thank you. So, my name is Eva Hoffman. I started life, though, as Eva Vidra. And I was born in 1945, really right at the end of World War II, in Krakow, Poland.
And what were your parents' names?
They were Boris and Maria Vidra.
What was your mother's maiden name then?
It was Burg, B-U-R-G, yes, which I found out probably, considerably later in my life, but that's what it was, yes.
Mm-hmm. And what did your father do post-war?
Post-war, my father had a very difficult time post-war. It was a very difficult immigration. He didn't have a proper profession really. But so for a while he worked as a shopkeeper and then in a kind of used furniture shop. As I say, it was difficult, yeah.
Was that as a result of education being disrupted during the war? What were your parents' experiences?
During the war? So, first of all, it is worth saying that my parents lived in the Ukraine before the war and through the war.
In which part?
Well, they were in a very tiny shtetl, in a very tiny town between Lviv and Tarnopol, called Założce. Very tiny. For a while I couldn't even find it on the internet finder. So that's where they grew up. My father was a kind of wild boy of the village, really. And he dropped out of school after 4th grade. It is worth saying that later he became most richly and wonderfully self-educated person I have come across. I mean, he was fantastically well-read. My mother finished high school. The president or the principal of the high school which she attended wanted to give her a scholarship to go to university, to go to college, but her parents would not let her.
Why?
Well, they were very orthodox, and I don't know if that was why, or if it was because they needed help in their shop. But she also became a fantastically well-educated person and well-read person.
What sort of shop was it?
Her parents' shop. Her parents' shop was a shoe shop plus a variety store. Yeah. Yeah.
And what characterized your own childhood in terms of religion? Was your father Orthodox?
Both of them lost their religion during the Holocaust. I mean, this was, one kind of effect that the Holocaust had. They couldn't sustain their beliefs after the Holocaust. So neither I nor my sister were religiously educated. My sister later did go to a Talmud Torah school, a religious school. I didn't. And our religious observance in Krakow consisted of going to a synagogue on Yom Kippur once a year because, they wanted to honor the dead. I'm not sure whether I just said it, but they lost their entire families in the Holocaust. So, siblings, parents, everybody. These were incredibly moving and interesting experiences for me, going to the synagogue. First of all, it was, a whole community in mourning. And so, there were candles for the dead, many, many candles for the dead. It was also the first time that I saw Hasidic Jews who were in a sort of separate kind of part outside, and I saw them, dancing together. So this was really my introduction to Judaism, yeah.
Did it in any way cause a rift between you and your sister that she went to a more religious school and you went, was it a private school or a state school?
No, it was a state school.
Did you grow up with different
I will tell you,
feelings?
that for a while my sister became, quite observant and quite religious. And she wanted us to observe things in ways which my parents weren't completely willing to do. So did it cause a rift between her and me? No, I don't think so. But, it caused a bit of, difficulty. So yes. But I think I've now moved to Vancouver, to Canada.
Oh, perhaps we could remain with your family for a little while. What would you say were, or what do you recall as particularly outstanding aspects of your life? Were you still in Krakow before you moved to Canada?
Yeah.
Well, then in Krakow, in terms of anti-Semitism, attitudes after the war lingering that were unfavourable?
Yeah. Look, as far as I was concerned, I had a happy childhood in Krakow. I had a very happy childhood in Krakow. And, when I was 7, I was taken for my first music lessons. And it turned out that I was, kind of pronounced to be talented. And I went to a music school, and I loved my music teacher, and I loved my music lessons. And I had, good friends. I remember really one instance of anti-Semitism, sort of, actually two, directed specifically at me. And one was this janitor in our building who was altogether a kind of crude person, semi-undressed, da-da-da-da-da. And I remember running past her up the stairs and her saying, "Oh, there goes the little Jewess." So that was one thing. Then in the 1950s, religion classes came to school because there was a kind of rapprochement between the church and the state in 1956. I should say that, there was another historical moment, which was when Stalin died. And everybody in the whole school cried, and I didn't cry. I was very proud not to cry, but this was already my parents' education, that, perhaps the death of Stalin was not something to mourn. But these religion classes started in school. So in the mornings, first of all, there was the singing of the Internationale, the sort of the Communist Party anthem.
So this is still in Poland?
This is still in Poland.
Yes.
So there was this anthem. And then, after this rapprochement, there was the Lord's Prayer. Mm-hmm. So I stood still through both. So the other anti-Semitic moment I remember was when these prayers started, and I didn't say them. And so afterwards, I remember, I think at the school was on a slight hill, because I remember running down the hill, and this group of kids started shouting, insulting things, and they were about to attack me. But another group of kids came to my aid and said, "Stay away." So in other words, I did not experience a lot of anti-Semitism. When I read later, books about, New York life, post-war, and Alfred Keyes and others, I don't think I experienced as much anti-Semitism as they did. But I should say that I am sort of counter-paranoid. I don't like to sort of, see prejudice or attacks too readily. Also, it must be said that my parents and the parents of my great childhood friend Victor, when they realized that religion classes were starting, they prepared us. They said, if people call you bad names, or if they call you bad names, or if they do anything nasty, just say you are stupid. That is real idiocy. So we were prepared for it. Yes, there was also a very comical moment when I found my sister, who was then 7, I was 11, praying in front of the light switch. Now, the reason she prayed in front of the light switch is because, all of our friends, and we visited, friends, had holy pictures in their houses, and we didn't. So, she took the next best thing. So, yes, there were comical aspects of this. But, on the whole, as I say, I had a happy childhood in Krakow. Krakow is a beautiful city, beautiful historic city. We did not have much money, although I think my father occasionally traded currency, which was, quite profitable. But it's a beautiful city. I remember going once weekly with my mother to a coffee house, where we treated ourselves to ice cream and coffee. My father went to this cafe near the big main square, a beautiful Renaissance main square, where he, gossiped and chatted with friends. So, yes, and Krakow itself is a very beautiful city, and it was sort of a pleasure to explore it.
To what extent did the communist regime impinge on your life, or were you not aware of that?
No, I was perfectly aware of it. We had May 3rd parades, but my father and I kind of snuck out as soon as possible. I think I did wear a red scarf because sort of everybody was supposed to. But my parents sort of educated me not to be a communist. Now, my parents were, my father had this bookshelf behind his bed, and he had the collected works of Lenin. This was in case the secret police visited us. And they did pay us a visit once. So, yes.
What happened? Why did they come?
I think they thought that my father had hidden money or illegal money. Not entirely untrue, but they didn't find out. So, yeah.
That must have been extremely frightening.
I don't think I was there when the visit happened. Yeah. But then, in fact, he was interrogated, I think. He was interrogated, yeah.
In your home or
no,
in the
somewhere
police
else.
station?
But in fact, much later, I tried to find the interrogation records, but I couldn't, yeah. But nothing really followed from it, yeah.
And at school, in terms of not praying, were you punished at all for that, or did the teachers understand that you were not going to take part in Christian prayers?
I think the teachers understood. As I say, there was this one moment of, being almost assaulted by some kids. But I think the teachers did understand. I remember the teachers being incredibly friendly to me and sort of loving my teachers, really. So yes, that was not a problem. And I was a very good pupil, so that helped. Yeah.
Good. What were your favorite subjects at school?
Well, they were literature. I think I really didn't like biology, in which we were supposed to memorize, facts about the blood system, and it was a good education, by the way. But it was literature, and we had to memorize some poems, and I loved the poetry. And we were supposed to, for example, talk about what we did over the summer when we came back, and I remember talking about it, extensively, and with great pleasure. So, yeah.
So what in that case, and for your parents, prompted them to think of leaving Krakow and emigrating? Was there a particular incident, or was it a series of events that evolved?
Well, in 1956-57, this government came to power, which was anti-Semitic and which encouraged Jewish immigration, which basically said we would not be unhappy if you left. So a lot of our friends left, including Victor, my great childhood love. And they left in 1956-57, mostly for Israel. For some reason, my father actually wanted to go to Canada rather than to Israel. There was, a big family debate. I very much wanted to go to Israel to follow friends, but my father, said, Israel will have wars. It was really quite prescient. There will be fighting, and I don't want my daughters to, have to fight. And so he wanted to go to Canada. There was another reason that he wanted to go to Canada. And again, I've tried to find out if this was really true, but this was really true. There was a book which he had when he was in hiding, and it was called Canada Fragrant with Resin. And it gave a picture of Canada as this paradisial, virginal place, of great expanses of nature and freedom. And so while he was, hidden in an attic, this, I think, had great appeal to him. So that was one reason, but there was the other reason as well. So this is why we went to Canada.
During your time in Poland and leading up to the time that you went to Canada, what did you learn about the Holocaust? What was the atmosphere in your home regarding the past? Or was it very much the past and we look to the future?
I don't think I was told things, or maybe I was. In fact, I was told some things. But my mother had nightmares. Both of them had nightmares. My mother had nightmares, and she often cried. And she cried particularly in mourning for her sister, who died when she was very young and whom my mother loved. And so I always knew about this sister who had died, and I had this fantasy that, this sister was somewhere in a place like New York or Argentina, and that I would go and find her one day and bring her back to my mother. I mean, it was a very strong fantasy. So there was that. My father remembered some adventures, really, because, he really did have adventures, and because before they went into hiding, I mean, there were moments when he escaped with his life by a hairbreadth, by jumping into an icy river, for example. So he talked about that as well. And he prided himself on being very physically strong, which he was. But he didn't talk about what happened. He did not talk about what happened. And it was not till much, much later that he started talking about his two brothers, whom he lost. And I remember a moment when I talked to him, this was later, and he cried. And this was, nearly unbearable for me to see my father cry. Yeah. I was aware of this. Yeah.
And were they resentful?
Sorry?
Were they resentful of the freedom that they had lost, but grateful to people who helped them? And did this carry through to you, this attitude?
Well, I think the fact that they were helped undoubtedly carried through to me, that not everybody was horribly anti-Semitic. And actually, well, much later, my sister and I went to the tiny little shtetl where my parents grew up, and it was a most moving experience. It was in 1997, and a member, we had a scrap of paper that my father left with a name written on it, Hrychko, and with thanks for, for helping him. So we went partly in pursuit of Hrychko, but it was a very amazing experience and trip. I won't tell you, in detail, because I could go on for quite a long time. But there we were in this tiny little shtetl, and we met people who remembered my parents very well. We met Olga, who, no, she was not responsible for hiding them. We met a member of the family. In fact, I do have a picture somewhere, which hid them, and we remembered everything which happened, and we all ended up crying. He was the son of the high school teacher, And he actually wrote about Jewish education. He was very interested in Jewish education, for example. You know, so this was not anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, when we went to Zawoszce, to this tiny little shtetl, yes, we heard tales of anti-Semitism. There was one person who was singled out who might have been implicated in something very bad, but on the whole, no. I mean, we were received, you know, like honored guests.
While you were still a young schoolgirl, did the past seem to weigh heavy on you? You said earlier that you were happy in Krakow.
I felt terribly sorry for my mother. And I remember, for example, one incident. We had nannies, you know, we had 2 rooms and a kitchen, and there was always a nanny, a kind of girl from the country in the kitchen. And I was very attached to some of these nannies. So she took me to church every Sunday.
Did you object?
I didn't object. No, I thought it was great. It was a beautiful space, you know, and I prayed, and but at some point, the priest said in a very kindly way, do your parents know you're here?
Mm.
I'm not so sure that you really should be here. And I stopped going. So I what was your question?
Oh, about the impact and whether you felt that your parents' past was a heavy load on you.
Yes. So this nanny took me to a park every Sunday, and also took me to church initially. But at one point, we stayed for much longer than we thought we would, and I came back, and my mother had a horrible migraine headache, and she said she was terribly worried about us, and she didn't know it. And I remember kneeling in front of her in bed and saying, I will never do this again. I'm so sorry. I was a child, so in a way it was excessive, but, I understood. Yes, so, I understood that she was a wounded person, yeah.
And she was ultra anxious about you.
Ultra anxious, and yeah.
Was she always anxious?
She later became a very, a very benign and rather happily tempered person. But that was considerably later, yeah.
So when exactly did you go then from Krakow to Canada?
We went in 1959. Yeah. I think it was April 1959.
And how did you go? What route?
Well, we went by ship. We went by ship, the Batory, which was also a kind of great experience, finding yourself on a ship, and having dinner with other people. And towards the end, there was the captain's ball, and the captain asked me to dance. It was all incredibly thrilling. It was very, very thrilling. And, there were friends whom I made on board, and there was a very, very visible shipboard romance, I think, between a Danish man and a Polish woman, or vice versa, and we all observed it, It was a great curiosity. And it was my very first glimpse of the West, because we stopped in Denmark for, a few hours, and we were allowed to disembark and see Denmark. And I thought, my God, this is sort of fantastic. And I think this was when I saw my first banana. There were people were eating bananas, and this was all very new. Yeah, I mean, I should say that in some post-war years in Krakow, food was not so easy to come by, and when the first tomatoes came, my sister and I were given them, and my parents, didn't eat them because they were difficult to get. And when friends from Israel started writing, well, you can have as many oranges as you want, etc., etc., this was all very wondrous. Yeah.
Alongside the thrilling experience of being on board the ship, was there a pang of sadness leaving what you knew or not? Not at that stage.
Enormous, actually enormous. I mean, the ship became a big adventure, but I remember, standing on the dock as, first of all, you're bringing back memories, very long ago memories, which I haven't thought about in quite a long time. First of all, when we left, my entire class, my entire elementary school class, or maybe just the beginning of high school class, first of all, they signed in, they wrote little things.
An autograph book.
It wasn't a photograph book, they were just writing things
Autograph.
in it. Autograph book. Yeah. And they wrote they all wrote things. And I cried and cried and cried for several days. And then they all came to the train station to say goodbye to us. And I cried and cried and cried. And then we went on the train, and I knew that, we were going to Gdynia or Gdańsk, I think Gdynia, to the port where we were going to leave. And I stopped crying. And I never cried for another 40 years. I mean, something, got very arrested. Yeah.
You're conscious of that still?
Well, I was for such a long time that I remember it, yeah. Yeah.
And your parents?
What about...
And your sister, how did they react at that stage?
Well, my parents very much wanted to leave. I mean, it was very much, their decision. And by the way, my sister and I smuggled some silverware under our big sweaters on the bet that we would not be, examined. Which, yeah, so...
Were people stopped and
searched? Yeah, searched, for sure.
As the Nazis had done when people tried to leave.
I wouldn't say exactly. I mean, it was there were illegal and legal goods that you could take out, and so people were searched. But my parents weren't. We weren't. And so, we had all of this silverware, whatever it was worth. But I can show you some china from Poland if you want. Yeah.
Did they regard those as precious things to take with them, something of Poland, something of home?
I think they hoped, perhaps they were attached to them more than they let on. But, I think they also wanted to bring some things to the family which sponsored us, because you had to be sponsored. You had to be sponsored by a family in Canada. I think our family was sponsored because of some pre-war acquaintance. And I think perhaps my father helped the man who sponsored us, who by then was very wealthy. And I'm sorry to say, a really horrible person. A really horrible person. And he threw us out of his house, I think, about 4 days after we came. So it was very hard. I mean, the first days,
What did you do? How did you manage?
Well, we went to stay with some old man for whom my mother worked as a housekeeper. But that was a real wound, that was a kind of ego injury. But that's what we did for a while. And then my father, started working for this business. Yeah.
Did they, that stage, at that point in time, perhaps regret having moved, or did they...
Did they regret having moved? I don't think they would have ever admitted it. I hated every moment of it. I hated this old man. But they couldn't admit that they regretted it. Yeah.
What were your first impressions, and how old were you and your sister when you arrived in Canada?
I was 13 and a half, and my sister was 9.
And what's your sister's name?
Sorry?
What is your sister's name?
It is Alina, which was changed to Elaine because we went to this newcomers school, and they, decided to anglicize our names. So mine wasn't very different. It was Eva from Eva. But my sister's was very different. It was Elaine from Alina. And later she went back to Alina. And I was Eva, really.
And how difficult was it, if it was difficult, to settle into a new school, to be given these names that almost removed your identity?
Yeah. Well, that was a very, salient moment. I remember being sort of renamed and thinking, but that's not my real name, and that's not my sister's real name. It was very, very difficult and, and very, very confusing. We were given directions as to how to go back from school back home. And I remember becoming lost. I mean, we became lost. We kept asking people for directions. Eventually, we found where we were going to, but it was confusing, and I mean, I was very unhappy. I think my sister adjusted more easily because she was younger. Yeah, and I really felt that, this man who threw us out it was cruel. Yeah.
Did you feel a sense of confusion? Did you feel disorientated?
I think I felt horribly disoriented. Disoriented, first of all, in a real sense, walking from school and not knowing where to go. Secondly, disoriented by that's sort of the very nature of Vancouver. There were suburbs, well, I didn't know about suburbs in Poland. And so what was this, what was this kind of place? What was this kind of place? I mean, it was all very confusing. The food didn't taste good. Nothing tasted good. And we were supposed to be extremely grateful and happy to be there. And I failed in that respect.
Did you find it quite overwhelming? Vancouver's a big city. Krakow is a much smaller city. And very different in nature.
Well, they're totally different in nature. Krakow is not such a small city. I'm not sure that Vancouver was so much bigger, but it was incredibly different. I mean, it was still a kind of frontier town. And, it really did not have a developed culture. Krakow had a very developed culture. and, very great sense of history and stages of history. Vancouver was a kind of frontier town, it really was. And it rained a lot. And we couldn't afford anything. And we went to this newcomer school. So it was not a happy experience. Those years were not happy. And I got out as soon as I could. Yeah.
How did your fellow pupils at school treat you? How did they regard you as unwelcome foreigners, or did some of them make friends with you at school?
I think probably some people did make friends, and there were other children of immigrants. But otherwise, no. I mean, they didn't understand. I mean, immigrants were thought of as sort of lesser beings at that point in Vancouver. They really were thought of as lesser beings. There is the immigrant. And there were very strange, phenomena like dating. Did I just tell you about this, or did I just talk about this? I didn't know.
No.
So dating was incredibly strange. So first of all, on the other hand, I think I must have had a lot of chutzpah, because now I don't remember how it happened. I think it was because I gave some speech at school, and some radio producer asked me to do a radio program, rather early on. I really don't quite remember how it happened, but there I was, talking on radio and saying that Canada is not as tolerant or wonderful as it thinks it is. And that there is a lot of prejudice. Yes, and then there was this, the high school prom, so we're a few years later when I was a bit more oriented. But I went to the high school prom with the one Japanese boy in the school. That was a very big scandal. So I talked on this radio program, and then I became, started performing a little bit. So I became sort of, I don't know if I was more accepted, but I was being singled out as a talented child. So yes, but I still did not love Vancouver. Yeah.
Thinking of you as a talented child, were you pressured by your parents directly or indirectly to work hard at school because you needed to progress in life, you needed to succeed? What was their philosophy? Some parents are very pushy and some are not.
My mother was comprehensively tolerant. I was supposed to practice a certain number of hours a day.
On the piano?
On the piano. This is not my old piano, but it was one of my first purchases here. But, she let me off the hook. If I didn't do the whole 2 hours, she just let me off the hook and let me go and play. In Vancouver, all of a sudden music did not have the same meaning, or the same sort of cultural cachet. So it wasn't so important. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but I was sort of semi-adopted by this wealthy family from Poland, Jewish family from Poland. They sort of semi-adopted me. And Edwina Heller, who was, they were the Hellers, and they were a very prominent family in Vancouver. And she had wanted to be a pianist, didn't become a pianist, but she, I think she paid for my music lessons. And I had a wonderfully mad Russian piano teacher. He really was wonderfully mad, Chernyavsky. And the name Chernyavsky is still recognizable here through some relative, but he was a member of the Chernyavsky trio, which traveled through the world. But by the time I met him, there was no Czerniawski trio. He was not a great. He was a wonderful teacher, though. I mean, he was a wonderful teacher, and he came to our house, to our very humble house. I don't remember. I think it was once a week, and he gave me piano lessons, and my mother gave him her cooking, which he adored, Jan Czerniawski. And so he took me through my adolescent years, and with these music lessons, he was quite wonderfully mad. I mean, once he came in a car, and there was a whole tea service on the top of his car, which he didn't notice. He also, I mean, if you want a slightly naughty story about, he took me to concerts, but a slightly naughty story was that at one point he said, "Eva, what is a human being?" I don't know. So a human being is three things: head, heart, genitals. So so it was all, yes. So that was a very heady experience in a way. Yeah.
And in a different way, was adapting to a new country a heavy experience in a different way, of course, for your parents? How did they settle in?
How did they settle in?
And how did they cope with it all?
Yeah, well, as I said, they had a very hard time, but, and gradually a less hard time. But it was their decision, and so I think I just said it. They decided to become Canadian patriots.
Oh, no, you didn't.
I didn't say that.
No.
Particularly my father. My father became a Canadian patriot.
Mm-hmm.
And, they loved going to the beach and to the parks, etc., etc. Yeah.
And did they, in effect, put the past behind them, or try to, do you think?
Did they?
Try to put the past behind them?
I think they did. I think they really did, yes. How successfully, I do not know, but they did, yes. And in fact, they did become happier in Canada.
But did that sense of adapting, and in terms of your identity, did you follow suit, or did you feel quite alienated from?
I felt very alienated, and as I say, I got out very quickly. I mean, after high school, I just left.
Where did you go and when?
Well, so we're 59 to 63. So in 1963, I went to Rice University in Houston, Texas. You might well ask why I went to Rice University in Houston, Texas. But this was partly the guidance of the Hellers, the family which sort of adopted me. And they found an article somewhere in Time magazine, I believe, which said that Rice University was a very good school, and the one private school in the States which did not charge tuition, which was true. I mean, tuition then started to be, charged by the time after I graduated, but this was true. So I went off to Rice University in Houston, Texas. This was, I actually had a very good time at Rice University, and I loved it, and I loved the education. It was a very good education, etc. But it was, yet another round of disorientation. I came there in 1963. If you remember your historical events in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, practically next door in my first semester, at Rice University. So, enormous turmoil on campus. I understood that something awful happened, but really didn't have the measure of it. I didn't understand enough. In addition, my first little boyfriend, John Dunlop, worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas Book Depository earlier. And, he said, when I asked him what was he like, a nice, quiet man, always sat in a particular corner looking out, which was interesting. Always brought his box lunch to the office, didn't talk to anybody. This was the portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald. Later I did, yes, yeah. So there I was at Rice University. There were also, another set of strange customs and habits to get accustomed to. But as I say, the first thing to say is that I was very happy to be there and that I was getting a very good education, really an extremely good education, which then took me on to a very valuable graduate fellowship at Harvard University, etc. And I had wonderful teachers.
Was it at your term in Harvard that you chose a career, or did it come to you? Did it somehow evolve?
Well, I knew that I wanted to study literature, and I did. But then, when I graduated, I decided I didn't want to follow an academic career. I made very unwise or, very reckless decisions the entire time, because following an academic career might have been, an easier thing to do. But I wanted to be part of a wider intellectual life. And so I went off. I had a postgraduate fellowship at some point, and I went off. I did teach briefly. I was taught at the University of New Hampshire and briefly at Tufts University. But then I went off to New York very recklessly. And I did have that postgraduate fellowship, but then I was, on my own at loose ends, etc., etc. And I had funny journalistic jobs before I landed at the New York Times, including one at the Runner magazine, a job in which I covered 3 marathons. And New Times and other things, and eventually I got a job at the New York Times. And that was, I really liked that a whole lot. I loved journalism.
And did you feel better living in New York than in Vancouver?
I did. I did.
Did you feel that you fitted in better?
Well, I mean, I did and I didn't. I was certainly happy. It was a much more, lively environment, and mostly I really liked working at the New York Times, so, and there were friends, and, there was a whole Polish cluster which came along at some point when martial law was declared. That was later, but nevertheless, and I, all of a sudden had Polish friends again.
Did you identify with them readily, or did you not want to really know them?
Well, first of all, most of them were Jewish, if this is what you're asking about. Or many of them were Jewish, most of them perhaps. No, it was all, now were at a completely different stage. But as I say, I was at the New York Times. First, so when they came along, I was asked to do a piece for the New York Times magazine on the new immigrants. And so I went to a party of these new Polish immigrants. And, they were the best dressed group of people I had seen in New York. So this was surprising. And, then I did, also it was funny because they thought that since I worked at the New York Times, I could have front page articles about each one of them. And I did have an article about all of them as a group, in fact, at some point. And some of them remained friends for quite a long time, and even till recently. So yes, but it was high intrigue. But I made Polish friends who, as I say, have remained Polish friends even till now, some of whom are now in Italy. My Polish mafia in Italy, as I call them, and some of whom have remained in New York. Yeah.
So, had you kept up your Polish? People often forget parts of the language. Were you able to converse fluently in Polish with them, or did they speak English?
No, that was when my Polish started, when I started recovering my Polish, which I did forget. I mean, I didn't exactly completely forget it.
But you didn't use it.
I didn't use it.
Yes.
It went underground, it went underground. And then when I started talking to them, it started coming back. And at first it was quite awkward, but, we talked in Polish and it did come back.
Did that make you feel better? Did you feel more whole?
Yes, actually, yes, I think I did. Because it was a kind of form of repression, a repressed language. And also, having this circle of Polish friends, that it reminded me about being Polish and growing up in Poland. Yes. And there was, a great deal of mutual understanding, which was, difficult to achieve.
And the interaction.
Yeah. So yes, that was a very nice development. And since they came when martial law was declared, I keep saying that I owe the return of my Polish to Jaruzelski, who was the horrible president then. Yeah.
So while you were in New York, what were your parents doing? Were they still in Vancouver?
Yeah, they stayed in Vancouver the whole time.
And what sort of work did they do? Was it difficult for them to find work?
Well, yeah. So first of all, I should say, I can't remember what I have just said or not, but they were terrified of my going to New York. They thought, did I say this?
I was going to ask you how they felt about that.
How can you possibly go to this, center of Sodom and Gomorrah? And New York, by the way, when I was there, was a pretty violent place. Later it became much less violent, but it was. So yes. So how did they cope? Look, they had a hard time all along. At some point, they managed to buy a small house, which then went up in value considerably. So they exchanged it for a very nice apartment. And, I think they, in effect, stopped working at some point. They had... my mother helped at the second-hand shop, in which my father worked. But at some point, I think they stopped working and, lived in this perfectly nice apartment and were extremely pleased by that. Yeah.
Did they expect you at any time to go back and look after them? Or did they express the wish that you would come home, so to speak?
I don't think so. I don't remember that they did, no. Did I feel a little bit guilty? Maybe, but in fact they were very well looked after, and there was a Polish carer who was wonderful, who mourned my mother when she died, as if, she was her own mother, and we stayed in touch for a while. So I don't think so. And I kept coming back to Vancouver fairly regularly. And I'm afraid I never got to like it better. But I did keep coming back to visit them quite regularly. But they were pleased with their fate and had their circle of friends. And my mother, I think, was, very well liked. She really was a lovely person. Oh, and yes, and there was a moment, they first came to the East Coast for my graduation from Harvard. But then they came when Lost in Translation came out.
I was going to come on to that.
Yeah, and it came out, and it turned out to be very successful, but who knew? But this was my then agent threw a party for me, and they were there. And my sister was there with her tiny child, Cleo. And it was a kind of completely heady and wonderful occasion. And my Polish friends, there were quite a few Polish friends, at some point started shouting, "Mama, Mama, Mama." They wanted my mother to speak. And she was, very, she was incredibly poised and eloquent and, and it was really a lovely occasion. So, yeah.
Did she have a strong Polish accent?
No.
And your father?
My father certainly did. My father for sure did, yeah. But she didn't. Yeah.
What prompted you to start writing initially? I know earlier you said at school you loved literature, which is why I asked you about your favourite subject. But what prompted you to write Lost in Translation in particular?
Well, first of all, I started noticing, I was editing a lot of writers. And I started noticing that I really envied them.
The writers?
Yeah,
yes.
I envied the writers, that I wanted to be one of them. And so I left the New York Times for a while. I got leave, and I wrote Lost in Translation. And then went very nicely. The man who had hired me in the first place called me back because it wasn't in fact leave, I just left, but I did then get some sort of scholarship for it. Again, my father in particular was, very set against this. He said, "You realize that that half of some great percentage of Americans are on some sort of support income, that they can't make enough money on their own." He thought it was a very, very bad move. But I wanted to do it, and it worked out. And so then I was very nicely summoned back to the New York Times, which didn't happen all that much, by the person who hired me in the first place. And he was then at the book review, and he hired me for the book review, because before that I was on other sections. Mm. Yeah.
Were your parents very proud of you then?
They were, although my father wouldn't quite admit it. He said, when I see a front page article by you, then I will be proud. My mother did admit it much more, yeah.
There's a very telling line in your book here. If I may read it, it's very brief. I can't afford to look back, and I can't figure out how to look forward. Do you still feel like that as a second generation child in any way?
I don't think I do, no. First of all, I have written quite a lot about it. Mm. And I think that was a way of, in a way, purging it and, and dealing with the experience. And I guess I felt that I had done my duty. I think that's what I felt, that I had done my duty. Secondly, let us note that I am in London. I mean, I emigrated yet again. And so, but that was my return to Europe. I wanted to be back in Europe. I did want to be back in Europe.
Did you find it cathartic writing this Lost in Translation, Life in a New Language?
I probably did. And what was particularly cathartic and unexpected were the responses from readers.
Yes.
Of which there were many, many. I think I had 500 letters or something like that.
Because people could identify with what you had written.
Because people apparently identified, and even all American people identified. Mm. They too understood, having a difficult adolescence and being alienated, etc. Mm. So I had all of these letters, and events and meetings, etc. So yes, I think it was cathartic. Yeah, yeah.
And you followed that up by, after such knowledge.
No, I followed it more immediately by Exit into History, mm-hmm. which was the occasion of my second departure from the New York Times. And Exit History was 89, and transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe, Solidarity, transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe. And I thought, this is the one historical event I must see. This is my part of the world. And so I embarked on this, journey through Eastern Europe. And I went through the 5 countries which had regained their, independence and democracy. So, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And it was, it was very, very fascinating. And in the middle of one of the trips, and really what I felt, what I started feeling, and I think I'm remembering Hungary for some reason, was that it was a difficult trip. I mean, I was on my own, traveling through these 5 countries with 2 heavy bags, 1 bag the second time. I thought, these were very impoverished countries, some of them, not all of them. Hungary was not so impoverished. But Bulgaria and Romania, very impoverished. And yet I felt, I understand this better than I understand America. Mm. I want to be in Europe. Mm. And so when all was said and done, I wanted to be in Europe.
And when did you return to your roots, so to speak? Did you go with your parents or your sister, or did you go alone?
You mean when I went to the shtetl? They had died by then. And my sister and I went in 1997, so after they both died. Yeah.
Can you describe how you felt at the time?
Going to the shtetl. Look, it was all, I have described it in After Such Knowledge. You know, there is a chapter on that. I mean, I'm afraid I could talk for a very long time, but it was, you know, it was an incredibly moving, and I suppose if there was a catharsis, this was a very cathartic experience.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, this was a truly cathartic experience.
It's important to go back to your roots.
To my, you know...
And to your parents' roots.
To my pre-roots, to my...
Yes.
To my deep, deep roots. It was. You know, as I say, it happened because of a scrap of paper that we found. But it was very moving, and the way that we were received was very moving. And on our last day there, they threw a banquet for us. You know, I was amazed, particularly this one woman whom we met on the first day, who remembered so much. And I remember sitting next to her at this banquet. I mean, it was all incredibly modest. It was like, you know, the back of beyond, you know, with geese walking across the street, etc. And I said, you know, you have such fantastic memory. And she said, we didn't have books here, so we had to have memory. And yeah, I mean, and she was right. I mean, it is a kind of phenomenon. And I met her 102-year-old mother.
Incredible.
Who was reading the New Testament with an eyeglass, and she remembered my parents and grandparents, and at the end of the conversation, she blessed us. And I really felt quite blessed.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's very special.
Yeah, it was. It really was. It was a very special visit. And by the way, I mean, just for one detail, I mean, I have described it in detail because it was all an amazing experience. Zawoszce is so small that we couldn't find it on the map. When we originally went to Lviv as a departure point, and we stayed there, I don't know, for 2 days. And, you know, I talked to various historians, and they couldn't find it on the map. They weren't allowed to have, you know, local maps. But our driver who took us, you know, to the small town was this Polish man who lived in the Ukraine by then for quite a long time, and who knew Ukrainian and Polish. And he had been a soccer coach, so he had to have local maps for his teams, and he took us to the right place. Otherwise, we might have gone to the wrong place.
Wow. And with your other book here, After Such Knowledge, you went back, you saw how things are, you know how things were, or you knew something of that. Why did you write After Such Knowledge about the Holocaust and responses to it? Because it's quite specific and it's quite different
I
from
will
your
tell you, it actually has a simple
autobiography.
answer. I was asked to write it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was asked to write it by a person who's still a friend and who, in fact, has given me a very nice assignment recently, which I can tell you about if you want, which was a lockdown assignment. Peter Osnos, who, as it happens, he ran this publishing house called Public Affairs. As it happened, we are from a very similar background, although he didn't quite know it, I don't think. Or maybe he did know it in part, but he didn't know that I had met his parents, for example, in New York. But anyway, he asked me to do it. He asked me to do it. And so I did, and it was, an interesting and difficult book to write.
But important for other second generation readers.
Apparently it became quite important. Apparently
Yes.
It became very important, yes, and it was discussed, and, I discussed it with people, yes, and that was very deeply gratifying, and this, this kind of decoding of memory, because there were other theories of memory that were, sort of current, and I proposed, this kind of memory. So yes, I was very happy to have been asked. In retrospect, I saw him recently. He was here recently, and as I say, he assigned me something else.
Because I think they're widely considered to be very valuable contributions.
I'm glad to know that, and if that is still true, I'm doubly glad to know that. Yes, for some reason anyway, it doesn't matter, yeah.
No, it's tremendous. Do you now think in Polish or in English? Not writing, I understand you're writing in English, but do you sometimes think in Polish?
First of all, actually, I write in English more now, in Polish more now, because I have, Polish friends to whom I email. I email in Polish. And, there are now quite a few Polish expressions taken from English, like mail.
Yes.
So I now use Polish more than I did for a long time. And I have seen my friends in Italy, and we have traveled together, and we have talked in Polish while we have traveled together, partly because they wanted me to, they wanted to retrain me. I went to India, I went to India with a group of friends, and we talked in Polish because, some of them didn't know English. So yes, actually, Polish has, they now coexist rather easily, although, English is my main language for sure. English is now my main language, yeah.
And when did you actually come to England?
I came
to work here. And to work here.
I came in 92, 93, something like that. About 30 years ago now.
And how did that come about? Was it a holiday, or was it at the invitation of a university?
No, as I say, as I was traveling through Eastern Europe, I thought I want to be in Europe. And then I had... so first of all, it had to be England. It had to be Britain, because you have the right language. There is the right language. And I had a Guggenheim Fellowship, which allowed me to take a year off and sort of experiment. And so I came here, and and by the end of the year, I absolutely knew that I wanted to stay. I had a very funny Polish friend who was who was in New York when I was anguishing about this, because it wasn't anguish, it was a very difficult decision. And I said, what should I, because particularly since the last sentence of Lost in Translation is, I am here now.
Yes.
And so I felt very guilty towards my readers. So I thought, should I survey my readers, about what I should do? What should I do? And she said, maybe you should be one of those English ladies who live in Italy. Anyway, but so I did decide. And people were very baffled on both sides of the, of the ocean. Why are you going to England of all places? And I kept saying, for the food and the climate, which then really was a joke, which isn't such a joke anymore. Yeah.
Have you ever wished that you had had a different post-war, non-émigré experience without being uprooted? Or do you feel that despite the hardships and all the adjustments, that you have grown as a person, that you have gained something? I know that's a major question.
Yeah, it is so difficult to imagine alternative histories. I guess I feel it has all been incredibly enriching. I mean, had I stayed in Canada, would I have had all of these experiences? No, it has been incredibly enriching. And interesting. It has been interesting. Yeah.
And opportunities that you perhaps might never have had in Poland.
Well, no, I wouldn't have had them. I mean, what might have happened is that there is a possibility that I would have become a pianist. I mean, there is that possibility. And for a while, that was very hard for me to reconcile myself to. I mean, that was difficult. And for, 2 years after I decided not to be a pianist, again, I'm not sure whether I'm repeating myself. So for 2 years, I couldn't touch the piano. That was very painful. But in the end, it was so much the right decision. And it was the right decision because while I could have been good and very good, I was not going to be Paulini. I was not going to be Rubinstein. And, the piano repertory isn't really growing, and the piano repertory has been played and recorded endless times. I couldn't have added anything new. And and in writing, I could do something of my own, and do something new.
Which you have, as we were discussing, yes.
Thank you. So in the end, it was actually the right decision, even if it was very painful to begin with. Yeah.
How do you think of yourself now, today? Do you think in terms of yourself as a Jewish person or as an international person with globalization, that you can be at home anywhere? Or do you feel that your roots are firmly in Poland and the Ukraine? Or perhaps a mixture?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like, one formulation that I use is that I feel like a rooted cosmopolitan. It's both. I mean, I feel very nicely rooted in Goldhurst Terrace, which, my formulation is that it's my midway point between Manhattan and Krakow, as I think I said. But at the same time, this place is wonderful to travel from. And I have traveled a lot, mostly for professional purposes, and this has been great,
Which you would not have had had you remained in communist Poland.
Nor in New York,
Not
actually.
for many years, at least until the
No,
post-communist
absolutely,
era.
certainly not. And not even in New York. I mean, writers are used differently here, you know. Being a writer is a different sort of proposition here than it is in the States. And I was used. I was, you know, invited to British Council conferences, you know, to run British Council conferences. There was one in Brussels, there was one in India. So, you know, so there was that. My Japanese translator, I can show you my 5 books in Japanese, invited me to come to Japan because particularly she wanted to talk about second generation issues with the post-Hiroshima generation.
Yes, I can picture that.
And I did, and I had incredibly moving conversations, but also, you know, saw Japan and met the Empress of Japan. So, you know, I spent a month in China. Did I just tell you about this? I didn't tell you about this, no. I spent a month in China, which was incredibly interesting. And yeah, I was interested in music in China, and I wrote something which I want to go back to. But I was told there were 32 million piano students in China. And of course, there have been some great and prominent Chinese, you know, pianists. That was very interesting. So Japan, India, South Africa. I went to South Africa, well, I mean, at the invitation of the Holocaust Center there, but I traveled all over South Africa and I was thinking about it the other day, talking about it to somebody the other day, so I'll tell you about this experience because it was actually very interesting. So at some point, when I was here, I got a phone call from somebody who said, I'm just coming out of a scholarship in Stanford. I think he was at Stanford. And I came across your book, After Such Knowledge, at an airport by accident. And I wonder if we could meet and talk. And so we met at a cafe near here. He turned out to be a black guy who later wrote a book called Knowledge in the Blood as a kind of, you know, acknowledgement. And we became, you know, fast friends, really. And then I went to South Africa, I think at the invitation of the Holocaust Center there. And, you know, I visited Robben Island where Mandela was imprisoned. And I traveled to other parts of South Africa giving, you know, talks. But I also went to the Bloemfontein University, which is where this man, Jonathan Jansen, had become the first black dean, the first black anything. And he wanted me to come and, you know, speak. And I did. And, you know, in between, well, I don't need to go into further detail, but it was all incredibly moving. And upstairs, I lectured then at the University of Bloemfontein. He did something completely amazing at his university, which is not to punish these white students. This is, you know, Bloemfontein, which was, you know, the heart of apartheid country, and, you know, these white students did absolutely horrible things to the black staff at some point, and everybody thought they should be expelled. And he said, no. He said, they're our children too, and we need to educate them. And he talked to them. Anyway, so then, you know, I lectured there. And it was all very moving. And upstairs, I have a hat and a blanket, which entitled me to sit in the circle of elders, which the students gave me.
Very honored.
very honorable.
Yes.
But I told them I can't find the circle of elders in London so far.
No, no.
Yeah.
Have you lectured here in London or in Britain?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, quite a bit. I say quite a bit, but have I lectured quite a bit here? I mean, I went to these, British Council conferences. So that was a British event, which I ran, and, I lectured there. I was working as a visiting professor at UCL, and in fact, I may go back to that. Yes, and I did that lecture. In fact, I may not identify myself as, as primarily Jewish, but I remember when the Corbyn government came in and there was the whole anti-Semitic scandal. I mean, I was so infuriated. I did lecture on that at the Jewish Community Center, JW3 near here. I lectured there, and I said that what was so infuriating about this was that this country is actually very careful about prejudice. It's not prejudiced. It's not supposed to be prejudiced against A, B, and 3, but this was a politically correct prejudice for a while. It was approved by the government, and that drove me mad. So I lectured on that. What else have I lectured on in this country? I did a series on conceptions of freedom. Yeah, I did quite a bit. Yeah.
Have you taken an active part in political events at all?
No,
because freedom it's something I was going to come back to, that the whole notion of freedom is so important.
Yes.
After enduring a communist regime.
Yes, well, absolutely, and yes, and the various conceptions of freedom, and also that that I was sort of looking at this notion of the concept of the degree of happiness and unhappiness was measured for a while everywhere. And the degree of unhappiness in countries which had most freedom was the highest. And so, I was trying to figure out why is freedom so difficult to use when you have it.
Yeah.
So yeah. But yes, but it was various conceptions of freedom also that there was a series of events, but so there was a political conception of freedom, scientific conception of freedom, religious conception of freedom. So there was a series of events on that.
And how did you react with the following the fall of communism in Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia? How did you react? Did you want to go back?
Well, that was when I went. That was when
No, but did you feel a sudden urge, or were you cautious?
You mean when I went back to travel through these countries? No, I felt an absolute urge. It was, a difficult trek. Just difficult logistically.
And did you go to Auschwitz?
I did. Yeah, I did. But did I feel scared? The only time that I felt scared, well, I had, there were so many interesting and sometimes funny moments. I remember going from Hungary to Romania, from Budapest, to Romania, on the Orient Express, so-called. So first of all, I remember, waiting for a whole day practically in the Budapest station. It was, incredibly hot. I had no water, nothing to eat. My 2 bags, it was really a kind of horrible day. Then I finally the train arrived, great big crush of people, so I crashed with everybody else. And, then went to the compartment store where I had, I think, a reservation for an overnight train. The seat on which I was sitting immediately collapsed.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But so then I went to the conductor's booth, and he gave me some water and some cheese and bread. And I thought, this is an act of mercy. This is an absolute act of mercy. Anyway, so then I went back and I slept. And then I woke up, and there were these policemen sitting on the berth. I thought, God, what is going on?
An instant reaction, having grown up in a communist
in Romania
country.
At that time,
Yes.
it was well justified.
Yeah.
It was still, it was post Ceausescu, but it was the first time that I saw shooting, people shooting at each other. But no, they were filling out documents. They were filling out various documents, and so we sat side by side, amicably,
Incredible.
until they left. So, yeah. But Romania was scary, and I remember walking in the dark, not on my own. But, just walking, because there were power outages all the time. So I think we got caught in a power outage. And, seeing some person coming towards us, and you didn't know, were they going to talk to you or to shoot you?
No.
So it was still a scary place. And, food was scarce. Food was very scarce. And, some of the drinks that we were given, like, I don't know, just, they were impossible to drink. So I was thirsty often, so yeah.
Having gone on your, what some people might regard as a pilgrimage back to Europe, did that make you feel more rooted, make you feel more whole? And have you spoken to second generation groups in this country about your experiences?
I did speak to second generation groups. And I, in a way, I wanted to question a notion of trauma which was too facile. So I did that. And, I think they found it interesting, They found it interesting. I did. Then I started being contacted by third generation people. They were contacting me, and they wanted me to read their books, and they wanted to meet with me. And it was very curious and interesting because they claimed to be traumatized, and they actually really were.
In what way?
I know it was believable. I think they couldn't sleep. They, had nightmares. And, more so than the second generation people. And I started thinking that it was maybe because they didn't know about the past. I mean, they knew that there was some kind of past, but they didn't know about it.
And now it's widely written about.
And now it's widely written about, yeah. Or it was maybe even widely written about, but they didn't know their family past.
Yes.
They knew there were, ghosts in the attic. So that was very interesting. I mean, I've lost touch with them, but some of them have gone on to write some interesting books, in fact. So there were all of these encounters. But, I was very surprised by the forms of English Jewishness and English Judaism.
In any particular way?
And I'm trying to remember how. I know how. Because English Jews here, and I have quite a few friends, are completely part of English life, completely assimilated, completely English speaking, but they know more about Judaism than New York Jews did, certainly,
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I mean, they tend to know Hebrew, they keep Passover. I know I went to the first Passover in New York, but they keep all the rituals, and at the same time they're utterly anglicized. So it's interesting, I mean, it's a very different form of Jewishness, really.
That's an interesting observation, because I'm not sure that some of them would actually agree with your concept of them.
In what way do you think?
That some might say that they were culturally Jewish,
Yeah.
but not in a religious sense.
Well, that's right. Well, that's right. But I mean, being culturally Jewish, somehow they know about Judaism. They're not religious, no. They're not religious, but they're really not religious, but they do keep these, rituals. Maybe I'm thinking about a publisher, in fact. Yeah.
Current events there, do they, and those in particular in the Ukraine, do they hit hard?
They hit very hard, and I'm going to excuse myself for just half a minute.
Of course.
No, they hit very hard. I've been in a state of complete disbelief. And, it's not the Holocaust what's happening there. But the degree of destruction is something that I saw in post-World War Warsaw. I mean, what can I say? It just seems to me unbelievable that it is happening. It seems to me unbelievable that it is happening. It seems to me unbelievable that we watch it on television. And in effect, it's not that we don't do anything, but we don't really do very much. I mean, there is a complete refusal to get really involved. And I understand the reasons, but, when all is said and done, I think the reasons are not good enough. I mean, I did a little something, through my Polish connections, because, there are lots and lots of Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And it's sort of interesting, I suppose, because I did it through a friend here who is from Afghanistan and who has been a friend for a long time. I mean, she left during the Soviet war, not recently, and who since then works with refugees and gives trauma counseling to refugees. And this is a case in which trauma is a warranted word, I think. So I put her together with a Polish friend who was a very important person in Solidarity, in fact. And I put them together, and Helena, the Solidarity person, helped her hook up with some organizations which do that kind of. So it's unbelievable, really. I mean, it's astonishing and unbelievable, and just too awful. I would gladly assassinate Putin. I'm sorry. But it's not easily done. Yeah. Except, of course, the Ukraine has changed enormously. I mean, I've been doing events relatively recently because of this chapter in a book on Soros that I wrote. And there is always a question about Ukraine. Is Ukraine a Nazi state? There is always that question because this is how it's being, portrayed now, of course. So that is also maddening. But also, the president is Jewish. The Minister of Defense is Jewish. This would have been unthinkable in my parents' times. I mean, completely unthinkable, I think. Yeah. It's just, a very eerie and strange sense of repetition. Yeah.
And the accusation that, and the Russian accusation that they're fighting the Nazis, it's an echo of World War II.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's inappropriate.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Totally inappropriate. I mean, there were a lot of pro-Nazis in the Ukraine. In fact, one of the interesting things about my parents hiding is that the second place where they were hidden by this peasant, by a hunchbacked peasant, who took them in, I think, initially because my father gave him a jacket or something, then got incredibly attached to them. But his sons were in the Nazi organization, pro-Nazi organization, Banderowcy, and it's only that the father forbade them to touch my parents, that they didn't. But so there were certainly, they were very anti-Russian then, because the Russians persecuted them horribly. So it was warranted then, but of course, really not now.
No. Eva, do you have a family of your own to discuss your experience as a second generation child?
I have failed to have children. And in a way, I feel that was a price of immigration. It just, couldn't really happen. Well, it was also a price of my, having got married and divorced a little too readily, completely on my initiative, but, nevertheless. So I got married and divorced, and then it was, for various reasons, really impossible. I mean, I was on my own. I had to make a living, etc. So it was impossible to adopt children. My sister adopted 2 children, and I was extremely close to them when they were children. I mean, they were, practically brought up by me as well. But no, so I don't have children. I did have a very nice husband, whom I proceeded to leave. No, but I have close friends and good friends and real friends. So I somehow don't really miss it, or maybe I did for a while and then and then I didn't. I'm also an incredibly impatient person. So I probably would have found living with somebody difficult. In fact, I know I would have. Because I left 3 men who proceeded to become very wealthy. So yeah.
And how does your sister how did she bring up the children, the 2 adopted children? as Jewish, or were they from Christian families?
No.
And did she pass any of her second generation experiences to them? Did she feel
Yes.
that they ought to know?
Yes, yes. In fact, one of my nieces visited me relatively recently, and she adored my mother. I mean, that was her close relationship, more than her own mother, for various reasons. But she adored my mother, and she remembered it. And they were bas mitzvahed. We didn't know when we were growing up about bas mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, but they were bas mitzvahed. Also, my sister was married to somebody whom she then proceeded to divorce. Seems to be a family tendency, but anyway. But he was, an all kind of a regular Canadian guy who then, at nobody's request, decided to become Jewish, and he became the most Orthodox Jew in Canada. So it was really a bit bizarre. And what these girls were supposed to make of it, I don't know.
No.
And now I think, they're not religious, basically. Yeah.
Right. Within your family circle, were there regrets about not knowing your grandparents and aunts, uncles, cousins?
There were great regrets, actually, about that. Yeah, there were. Yeah.
Especially in the continental family, the family unit is so important, and the extended family unit, and in Jewish families.
Yeah. No, it was a regret. And as I say, when I was, a child, I had this fantasy of bringing my mother's sister back. So yes. But, eventually I accepted it. I did accept it.
Did you know anything about your grandparents pre-war? As a child, did you know anything about what they were like or what they did before the war, your grandparents? Or were they just an enigma?
I think my parents told me, bits about them. Yes, they did tell me some bits about them.
What did they say?
I think my mother was resentful of her mother for, not letting her go to college, I think my father was the wild man of the village. And did he tell me much about his parents? No, but my father didn't talk much altogether until late. So, I knew that they had an inn, which was one of the Jewish professions. So no, I didn't know very much. And I actually tried to, do some research considerably later, but there was nothing that came up. It really was lost to history. There was another Wydra family, but they turned out to be another family. So, yeah.
Is it a life of a mixture of regrets and thanksgiving?
Interest and pleasure, I would say. Yeah. Do I regret? No, I think I no longer regret. Je ne regrette rien was one of the songs we listened to when I was growing up. It was Edith Piaf. So, yeah.
Is there a message, something that you would specifically like to say for anybody who might be looking at this interview in the future? Or
think for yourself, first of all. Don't get seduced by all of the, swirl of ideas and tropes and, digital Twitter tropes and, which are now given to us as sort of ways of thinking. Think for yourself, it's useful to try to put it together. It's actually useful, to write things occasionally. I mean, writing is very clarifying. It's clarifying partly because you cannot put two sentences together without knowing what you want to say. So to whom am I giving this advice again?
to anybody who might be looking at your interview or reading about it?
Yes. Advice. Well,
Oh, not necessarily
Yes.
advice, but an observation or
A what?
an observation or commentary.
I think, having interests, being interested, being mentally active as well as physically active is very important. I would say that this is very important. And I think, that being mentally active and using it in my case for writing, but not only for writing, but for thinking things through, observing relationships, has been for me a kind of a life and self-saving mode of being.
Thank you very much indeed
Thank
again
you.
for agreeing to be interviewed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed. So this is the one pre-war picture which survived the war in my family. And it is a group of young women in the tiny shtetl of Założce, where they all lived, in the 1920s, I believe. And my sister, my mother's sister, is third from the right. I need to recheck whether she's third from the right. Yes, she is third from the right.
And her name?
Her name was Alina. My younger sister was named after her. I was named after my father's mother. Yes, so this is a photograph of my parents just after the war, with me as a baby in the middle. I was born in July 1945, so I don't know when this was, September, October 1945.
Yes, please.
Again, this one. So this is a photograph of me, I think, taken in the photographer's studio when I was about 4 years old in 1949.
Yes, please.
So this is a picture of me in 1955 when I was 10 years old, on vacation, on winter vacation, in a resort called Zakopane in the Tatra Mountains, or just below the Tatra Mountains. and I am wearing this folk costumes, or a costume of a group called Górale, which is a particular kind of sub-ethnic Polish group, sort of perhaps as the Welsh might be to the English, who built absolutely beautiful houses in their area. And when there were a lot of Polish workers in London, and a lot of workers who worked on houses, a lot of them were from that area. So this is a photograph of my sister and me, not long before we left Kraków for Canada. So I am 12, 13, she is 8, 9. And I am at this stage very protective towards my younger sister, Alinka. So, oh God. So this is me on the right, for some reason trying to look smaller than I am, with several others who on shipboard, on board of the ship Batory, which took us from Poland to Canada.
Okay. The date?
So, shall I just repeat the whole thing?
Just the date.
In 1959. Yes, so this is a photo of an elementary school in Canada, the first school that I attended there. And I'm sorry, it is not elementary school, it's just the beginning of high school. Shall I say it again? Okay. So this is, I'm just trying to remember the exact year, 75, I think. Does it have it? Yeah, 73, 63, 68, 73, 73. So this is a photo from my PhD graduation ceremony from Harvard. And I am in the middle, surrounded by my parents. And the year is 1973. Yes, so this is a photograph of me shortly after I wrote my first book, Lost in Translation. I think it was taken probably in 1987. So this is me in New York in 1990, shortly after Lost in Translation came out, in my New York apartment, being a writer. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a photograph of my older niece's bas mitzvah. On my right is my sister, her mother, and below on the right is my mother, who was my niece's Cleo's favorite person. And above Cleo is her younger sister Anna and her father Alan. And then all the way on the left, it is me, and I have gone to Vancouver to be present at this occasion.